Hello and welcome to lecture number 66. This is topic 4.13, the Black Feminist Movement, Womanism, and Intersectionality. There is one learning objective, and it's explain how the Black Feminist Movement of the 20th century drew inspiration from earlier Black women's activism. Throughout U.S. history, Black women have played a central role in the struggle of freedom and racial and gender equality. Some notable examples from the 18th and 19th centuries include Jarena Lee, who was born in 1783 and became an African Methodist Episcopal Church preacher. She was the first African-American woman to publish an autobiography. Her writing not only chronicled her life, but also provided a rare insight into the spiritual and social challenges faced by Black women during her time. We've already discussed extensively Sojourner Truth, who is an abolitionist speaker who uniquely addressed the ways racism and sexism afflicted Black women. Truth's famous speech, Ain't I a Woman, delivered at the 1851 Women's Rights Convention, is a cornerstone of feminist rhetoric. Another significant figure is Harriet Tubman, who was a conductor on the Underground Railroad and helped free hundreds of enslaved people before slavery was abolished. Beyond her work as a liberator, Tubman became the first woman to lead a military operation during the Civil War, guiding the Combahee River Raid in 1863, which freed over 700 enslaved people. In the 1960s and 1970s, a new feminist movement emerged. This was the second wave of feminism, which arose from the rights revolution of the 1960s, spurred by the Civil Rights Movement. The work of the Civil Rights Movement culminated in the 1964 Civil Rights Act and inspired other marginalized groups to organize and adapt similar strategies to fight for their rights. While the second wave of feminism was largely led by white women, many of whom had been members of civil rights groups like SNCC, its legislative successes included the inclusion of sex as a protected class under the Civil Rights Act, the creation of the National Organization for Women, or NOW, in 1966, and Title IX in the Civil Rights Amendments of 1972. Title IX addressed gender discrimination in education, including sports programs. Another landmark achievement was the Supreme Court decision in Roe v. Wade in 1973, which legalized abortion nationwide. Despite these successes, their campaign for an Equal Rights Amendment, or ERA, ultimately failed to staunch conservative opposition, led in part by activists like Phyllis Schlafly. The ERA debate underscored tensions within the feminist movement, particularly over issues of race and class. Black women, however, faced exclusion and marginalization within both the feminist movement and the civil rights and Black power movements. Their experiences were unique because they endured the dual oppression of racism and sexism. Elaine Brown of the Black Panthers explained it this way: a woman in a Black power movement was at best irrelevant. A woman asserting herself was a pariah. As a result of this marginalization, Black women splintered off to form their own organizations. The Third World Women's Alliance, or TWWA, was one of the most radical groups as it incorporated elements of communism into its ideology. The TWWA emphasized the interconnectedness of struggles against racism, sexism, and imperialism, drawing inspiration from global liberation movements. It included Black women, Chicano women, and Asian women, tying feminism to a global scale. One of their most prominent campaigns was the movement to free Angela Davis, who had been accused of supplying weapons to individuals attempting a prison escape. In 1970, Davis was implicated in a courthouse shooting in Marin County, California, where firearms registered in her name were used in an escape attempt that resulted in 4 deaths. She fled the state, landing on the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitive list, and after her arrest, Davis was incarcerated for over a year before her acquittal in 1972, with activists worldwide rallying for her defense. Davis's trial became a focal point for activism, symbolizing the broader struggle of Black women against systemic injustice. After her release, Davis continued her activism, writing extensively about feminism, prison abolition, and intersectionality. Her book, Women, Race, and Class in 1981, critiques how mainstream feminist movements often neglected the experiences of women of color and working-class women. She also helped found Critical Resistance in 1997, an organization dedicated to dismantling the prison industrial complex. Other organizations formed during this era include Black Women Organized for Action, the National Black Feminist Organization, and the National Alliance of Black Feminists. One notable group we'll discuss in more detail is the Combahee River Collective, whose founders emerged from the NBFO. The Combahee River Collective is particularly remembered for its 1977 statement, which articulated the concept of intersectionality long before the term was formally coined. The Combahee River Collective was a Boston-based Black feminist and lesbian organization. Its co-founders included Barbara Smith, Beverly Smith, and Demita Frazier. They named themselves after the Combahee River Raid, a Civil War military operation led by Harriet Tubman in 1863 that helped free more than 700 enslaved African Americans. This historical event, one of the most successful liberation missions led by an African American woman, served as a powerful symbol for the collective's commitments to freedom and justice. In 1979, the Combahee River Collective shifted its attention to the unsolved murders of 12 black women that occurred over a span of 5 months in Boston. They criticized the Boston Police Department for its inaction and failure to acknowledge the murders. To raise awareness, they printed and distributed pamphlets like the one seen on the screen. These pamphlets highlighted the rising death toll as the number of murdered women continued to increase throughout the year. The collective's efforts drew attention to how systemic neglect and institutional racism rendered black women's lives invisible in both media coverage and public discourse. In 1977, the Combahee River Collective issued their collective statement, which became a foundational text for black feminist thought. The statement argued that women's liberation would free all members of society. They emphasized that black women's experience interconnected systems of oppression such as racism, sexism, classism, and homophobia, making their liberation essential for dismantling all forms of discrimination. This framework became one of the earliest articulations of what we now recognize as intersectionality, a term later coined by legal scholar Kimberlé Crenshaw in 1989. The collective statement also criticized the racism within the predominantly white feminist movement and the movement's failure to address issues most relevant to black women. For example, issues such as poverty and welfare, critical concerns for many black women in the 1970s, were largely ignored by white feminist groups who often prioritized issues like workplace equality and reproductive rights without considering the broader economic and social struggles faced by marginalized communities. This omission highlighted the limitations of mainstream feminism and underscored the need for an intersectional approach that could address the unique challenges faced by black women and other women of color. Next, we'll move on to the concept of womanist or womanism coined by Alice Walker in the 1980s in her collection of essays, In Search of Our Mother's Gardens, Womanist Prose. This collection explores different types of oppression, the role of art, spirituality, and the experiences of black women. The term womanism was introduced as an alternative political identity to what Walker perceived as the exclusionary nature of mainstream feminism. Womanism emphasized an opposition to both racism within the feminist movement and sexism within black communities. Walker described a womanist as someone who is committed to the survival and wholeness of an entire people, male and female, highlighting the intersectional struggles faced by black women. This concept built upon earlier forms of black women's activism in literature. For example, in 1979, Michelle Wallace wrote Black Macho and the Myth of Superwoman, a critical response to the Moynihan Report of 1965. The Moynihan Report, officially titled The Negro Family, The Case for National Action, blamed the structure of black families, particularly matriarchal leadership by black women, for societal issues in the U.S. such as poverty and crime. Wallace's book challenged the misogynistic assumptions in the report and critiqued the Black Power movement for perpetuating harmful stereotypes about black women. In 1970, an anthology edited by Tony Cade Bambara titled The Black Women collected works by influential writers. This anthology provided a platform for black women to articulate their experiences and perspectives during the second half of the 20th century. It's among the first major collections to present black feminist thought and included essays, poetry, and stories that addressed topics such as racial and gender repression, motherhood, and the struggles of black women to claim their voices within both feminist and civil rights movements. And finally, moving into the latter half of the 20th century, we come to Kimberlé Crenshaw's work on intersectionality. By the early 1980s, most of the black feminist groups we've discussed had disbanded. However, the idea of overlapping systems of oppression based on race and gender continued to be explored and developed, particularly in academic spaces. Although black women in academia may not have always identified themselves as black feminists, they continued to examine issues of identity, gender, and oppression. Kimberlé Crenshaw was one of the key figures in this intellectual tradition. She introduced the concept of intersectionality in two major works, her 1989 paper, Demarginalizing the Intersection of Race and Sex, and her 1991 article, Mapping the Margins, Intersectionality, Identity Politics, and Violence Against Women of Color. In these studies, she established a framework for understanding the unique experience of black women and other marginalized groups. One of Crenshaw's key examples in her work was the legal case of DeGraff and Reed versus General Motors from 1976, in which 5 black women sued GM for employment discrimination. The courts dismissed their claims, reasoning that black women could not combine claims of both race and gender discrimination. Instead, they had to fit into one category or the other. Crenshaw used this case to demonstrate how existing legal frameworks fail to protect people whose identities spanned multiple axes of oppression. This example underscored how institutional systems such as the law often reinforce marginalization of individuals who exist at the intersections of multiple social categories. Crenshaw argued that social categories such as race, gender, class, and sexuality do not exist independently of one another. Instead, they overlap and intersect, creating compounding experiences of oppression or privilege depending on a person's position within these categories. For example, Black women often face racism in feminist spaces and sexism in anti-racist spaces. Crenshaw emphasized that these forms of discrimination cannot be addressed separately as if they exist in isolation. Instead, they must be understood as interconnected and mutually reinforcing. A quote of hers that encapsulates all of this is, "When feminism does not explicitly oppose racism, and when anti-racism does not incorporate opposition to patriarchy, race and gender politics often end up being antagonistic to each other, and both interests lose." This insight highlights the shortcomings of single-axis frameworks that fail to account for the ways in which multiple forms of discrimination intersect, leaving Black women and other marginalized groups unprotected by both feminist and anti-racist efforts. Crenshaw's work was deeply connected to earlier Black feminist scholarship and activism. It built upon Alice Walker's development of Womanism, which focused on the specific challenges faced by Black women, as well as the Combahee River Collective statement, which articulated how Black women experience double discrimination due to both the race and gender. Crenshaw's concept of intersectionality provided a name and a theoretical structure to describe the realities that Black women had been articulating and resisting for decades. By providing this framework to understand these interconnected oppressions, Crenshaw scholarship has strengthened the ties between Black feminist thought and earlier activism, ensuring that the struggles and experiences of Black women remain central to the ongoing discussion about justice and equality. And finally, here's a recap. Black feminists in the 1970s followed a long tradition of strong Black female leadership that dates back to the 18th century. The Combahee River Collective argued that Black women's liberation would in turn eliminate all forms of oppression. Alice Walker coined the term womanism in the 1980s as a response to exclusion of Black women in the feminist movement, and Kimberlé Crenshaw's framework of intersectionality analyzes how frameworks of inequality and oppression overlap and uniquely impact Black women. Thank you for watching. If you would like to watch the next lecture, click the thumbnail on the screen, and if you would like more resources to help you study, you can visit apushslides.com/AFAM. I wish you the best of luck with your studies, and I hope to see you back on the next lecture.